Good afternoon, everyone. This is Glenda Rose, president of FOSA, and welcoming you to an exciting program that we have today on the Revolutionary War skeletons that were found in Ridgefield. Personally, now, I love finding artifacts when out in the field. Lithics are always wonderful. Ceramics, buttons, coins, kaolin pipes are great finds, too. Maybe not so much nails and window glass, but the find is always exhilarating, and then piecing together the story is just as fun for those of us interested in archaeology. But the discovery of bones in Ridgefield is compelling to a bigger audience because we can identify with these individuals. Part of it, I think, is an emotional response because we know those young men were someone's child, brother, or husband. In addition, they are part of recent history, so it's possible to conduct research that may reveal a fairly reliable history of these gentlemen. I've been following this story from the beginning, and I'm looking forward to any new updates. So now I'd like to turn it over to Sarah for the rest of the introductions, and thanks for joining.
Thanks, Glenda. Welcome, everybody, to our May show. So tonight we have a really great show planned with a fairly large panel of guests, a lot more than we usually have. We've got Glenda and Scott, who are co-hosts, of course. We're also going to be joined on the phone by our State Historian Walt Woodward and our State Archaeologist Emeritus Nick Bellantoni, as well as Fiona Jones in the studio, who was there for the excavations of the burial. So we're going to be talking about the Revolutionary War Battle of Ridgefield and the 2019 discovery of 4 18th century burials that may be associated with the battle. So Walt, Nick, Fiona, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Is everybody here on the line?
Sarah. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Walt Woodward, how are you? It must be a day or two.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so this past weekend, Walt, Nick, and I were all invited to participate in the celebrations as the town of Ridgefield commemorated the 245th anniversary of the Battle of Ridgefield. So this was a significant battle for Connecticut in the Revolutionary War, but also it turned out in the larger course of the war. So maybe the best way to start would be, if Walt, could you give us a little bit of background information on the battle and its significance before we start to talk about the archaeological finds?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So much thanks to you and Nick and all the work that's been generated as a result of the find in 2019. The facts of what we know are changing, but the strategic importance of the battle is still the same. And here's the situation. In 1777, the British were actually, maybe for the first time since the Revolutionary War began, they were thinking, we can win this one, and we can win this battle this year. And the key to their strategy was isolating New England from the rest of the country. They were absolutely convinced that the American Revolution was caused by those upstart radical New Englanders, and if they could simply hide them off from the rest of the country and control them, the war would end and life would be fine in the colonies again. So part of their strategy, the grand strategy in 1777, was to use the Hudson as a way of linking two British armies, one in New York, they had taken that from Washington the year before, and another one that would come down from Canada. George Washington had strategically placed both troops and supplies along the Hudson Highlands so that the Continental Army would be able to engage either of these British armies when they set out to link up. Key to supplying that army was supplies, and the Continental Army, the Patriots, had big supply depots at Peekskill in New York, and then to hedge their bets, which was a good idea, they came farther inland to Danbury. Danbury, they figured, was probably the safest place to store supplies there could be. It was deep inland from both the Hudson River and the Connecticut coast. So they reasoned no British army will ever attack there. Well, sure enough, a month or so before the Danbury raid, which took place on April 25th or 26th. Anyway, last week, 245 years ago, the British had invaded Peekskill and destroyed a quartermaster depot there. In April of 1777, British Governor William Tryon led a fairly substantial, almost 2,000, I think the number is estimated at 1,800 British and Loyalist troops. They sailed from New York, they landed at Campo Beach in Westport, and they did an overnight forced march to Danbury. They got to Danbury. The Patriots in Danbury, a very small force compared to the British, had been drawn off because Tryon had sent ships up the Hudson River to make it appear that they were going back to Peekskill to finish the job. The Danbury troops heard that the British were sailing for Peekskill, and many of them left to go help defend that place, which left Danbury all but undefended. The British came into the town. They effectively got the American stores there, and then they burned an estimated dozen houses that they thought were the houses of patriots who were secretly storing supplies for the Americans. So it was, the Danbury raid was a great British success, but it also enraged the patriots. This idea of burning civilians' houses was considered, a foul play to many of them. The British thought it was fair because they were hiding contraband. The net effect was riders went out across the countryside, and much as in the way that it happened at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the patriots rallied from hither, thither, and yon. They literally, we don't know yet where all they came from, but east, west, north, south, there were riders like the legendary Sybil Luddington, the 16-year-old girl who rode out from Carmel, New York to tell people the British were coming. What happened was, the next day, the British and the Patriot forces that had gathered, and they were still coming. It was kind of chaotic. They met in Ridgefield, and it became a running battle. There were, I think, 2 or 3 major encounters. One of the biggest ones was at an intersection of roads at a ridge top. Of course, it's named Ridgefield because of this ridge top. And there, the Patriot Army, led by Benedict Arnold, General David Worcester, had already encountered the British and been mortally wounded before they got to the ridgetop. There was this huge encounter. Benedict Arnold was shot from his horse, and yet the Patriots still rallied. It's one of those great stories. Even though the British were outnumbered the Americans, they were more militarily skilled. The Patriots held their own, and they resisted the British all the way back to Campo Beach. By the time the British got back to their ships, I imagine most of them wished they had never come, even though the battle is considered a British victory in most counts. It was one of those victories you might want to have rethought. Excuse me, rethunk? Did I really say that? Wow, it's been a long day.
I've used rethunk before, so.
That was a great recap of the battle. Thank you so much for that. And, it's interesting. This has always been kind of a significant event for the town of Ridgefield. It's always been a significant part of Revolutionary War history for Connecticut. But for all of us, we got drawn into this story in a different way in December of 2019 with the discovery of 4 burials in the cellar in a house in Ridgefield that brought us into the battle and the story of the battle from an archaeological perspective. So, for this part of the discussion, I'm going to turn a lot of it over to Nick and Scott and Fiona because you were all there on the ground. But, Nick, you were called in soon after the burials were first discovered. can you talk a little bit about that discovery and how, how you began to think that they may be related to the Battle of Ridgefield?
What was happening was in a dirt cellar of a house that was originally built in 1790, they were lowering the dirt basement in order to, kind of develop their, basement into a playroom for their kids. So the contractors came in and they started lowering the grade so they could lay cement. Well, in lowering the grade, they hit skeletal remains. And because of the skull that came out, they recognized right away that these were human. So they did the appropriate thing. They called the police. The Ridgefield Police Department came in. They took a look at it. Had no idea what they were looking at in terms of whether it was a modern criminal investigation or whether this was something historic. So they contacted, by law, the medical examiner's office in Farmington, who sent their forensic anthropologist out there, Dr. Kristen Hartnett-McCann. She went out and she encountered the first burial, and she did an excavation of that burial. And what she found was, and made a decision right away, that the remains were, in fact, old. You could tell by the cortical loss and decomposition of the bone that they weren't dealing with anything modern, but that these people had been buried, or dead for 100 or plus years. So at that point, she contacted me, and I was serving as the interim state archaeologist at the time. And we went down there. And I remember I grabbed Scott, who was with us, and Scott and I were driving down there, and I knew the location, which was right behind the barricade that Walt had talked about. And, I said to myself, could these be part of that Revolutionary War battle? Or were we encountering something else, the remnants of a colonial graveyard or what have you? I had been to town 10 years earlier and had done some ground-penetrating radar in the general area because of the stories that were abound about mass graves of patriots and British soldiers. So I'm you don't want to be biased before you get out there, but the thought of a Revolutionary War battle victim was on my mind. We get there, the burial that the medical examiner had taken out turned out to be an adult male. Forensically, they determined he was 25 to 45 years of age, had a stature of 5'11", pretty tall back in possibly the 18th century. No signs of trauma and no associated artifacts. There were nothing like buttons or bows or buckles or boots, just plain. But what ended up happening is a second burial became uncovered. And when we got there, Scott and I got there, we started to encounter that second burial. Now, again, they were continuing the work. They thought they got the one burial out, and that was it. But another one showed up, and that's the one we started to work on archaeologically. And so what happened was, my thoughts again were, could this be? But, right now we had one body that was laid out in an east-west orientation, head to the west, which is a classic Christian burial practice because, the belief that you need to be prepared on the day of resurrection when Christ will come up with the sun out of the east and literally draw you from your housing. So that's a classic Christian burial practice. And so historically in New England, that's what I'm seeing. But then a third individual became uncovered. And that third individual was in the same grave shaft, if you will, with the second individual. In other words, they were together, commingled, arms and legs overlapping each other. And that's when we started to realize that we were probably dealing with some haphazard burials. There was no coffin nails. There were nothing recovered that indicated separate coffins. And it turned out these two new individuals were also adult men and very robust from what we could determine in the field. So suddenly we had ourselves involved in what we thought might be just simply a burial ground, but possibly now serving as victims in a mass grave of the Revolutionary War battle in Ridgefield.
So, these burials were found in the basement of the cellar of somebody's house. So you and Scott and Fiona were there, right? Because you and Scott started the excavations and realized that there was, it was going to be a significant undertaking as you started to find more and more burials. But, what was it? What were the working conditions like down there in the cellar? And what was it like working in somebody's house every day?
Well, it was quite tight, and we were dealing with remains that were partially under the foundation of the house, which really concerned me about the stability and safety and so forth. But we were blessed with a great crew. We had volunteers from the Office of State Archaeology, Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, Archaeological Society of Connecticut. Fiona came down with us, as well as Gary Aronson from Yale University, a biological anthropologist. And we had quite a team, and it was very difficult. Not so much, I think, the conditions of the first two burials, because they were kind of open next to the foundation. But what made the excavation so difficult for us was that the matrix of the soil was a compact clay. Now, we don't usually find burials in clay. Burials are usually found in places where it's easy to dig, glacial till and sandy soils. And in fact, interestingly enough, the burial that the medical examiner's office took out, the very first burial, was in fact in a sandy, silty matrix. So it was pretty easy. But our new discoveries together in the common grave created a situation where they were laid in pockets of clay. And that really made the excavation extremely hazardous, if you will, or difficult, simply because, you had, bone preservation, which was, as we say in Italian, mensa mensa, in other words, so-so, and yet with this fragile bone, we were trying to get this hard clay away from it, and it was really quite a very difficult excavation. And then, to complicate things even more, we found another individual. And this individual now was almost completely, if not completely, under the foundation. So at this point, we have 4 individuals, 3 in a common grave, overlapping each other in a soil matrix that made it really hard to excavate.
And another, our newest discovery is again an adult, robust young male.
Right.
Now, once we get to this point where we need to work underneath this big stone footing, it was actually, I think, if I remember right, it was 3 meters, so it's about a 9 or 10 foot wide footing. And we need to get under there and remove these skeletal remains. The problem is you can't do it from the top down, right? That's the standard archaeologically practice. We bring the dirt and the soil back until we expose it from the top, and we work our way down. So I thought one of the greatest challenges that there was to work from a side view. We moved in from the side.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to excavate a burial vertically, if you will, into its side, as opposed to, like you mentioned, Scott, coming down horizontal. So yes, that, along with the clay, represented a real difficult challenge to you guys. You did a wonderful, wonderful job, especially the recording of buttons that were now starting to come up, and from underneath the foundation, which, again, their mapping and positioning became really quite the challenge.
Now, one of the things we had going for us at that time was Fiona Jones is a lot smaller than me, and she was able to fit underneath the giant footing in the basement. So, Fiona, can you talk a little bit about the challenge that you had working at that site?
Yeah, so just to give some context, I believe I'm correct in saying that the previous owners of the house put a concrete slab to support a furnace in the basement. So when we found a as Nick called it, the second and third individual, and the third individual was partially under this concrete slab, but in a way that we could still kind of only have to wiggle a little bit. It wasn't so bad. We just had to wiggle just a little bit to get underneath this slab to get the lower half of that third individual. But it is funny recalling actually excavating and working alongside Gary Aronson on the third individual, and we're carefully, pushing away dirt to expose that person's left upper arm. And then as we're pushing away more dirt, we find another long bone, and it's another upper arm bone. And we kind of look at each other, and he was like, he gave me some grief for finding another person, and he was like, "That can't be another one." We were, the clock's ticking. These people want to get all these archaeologists out of their basement and finally get construction going. So that's the discovery of the fourth one came about that way. But so what it meant though was the last stretch of the excavation for us was a lot of Scott and I, wiggling underneath this concrete slab that had a furnace on top of it, just to get as much as we could of that fourth individual out. And I believe we got him in his entirety, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to wait for Gary's analysis, but I think we did pretty well in recovering complete, from toe bones to skulls. I think we did some good work there.
Yeah, well, and especially knowing the soil and how it had been breaking down the bones, we weren't gonna just try to take whole, try to take the bone completely out. It was a lot of blocking out the soil in a way so we could just take out these almost bricks of soil that had the bones in them, so that they can be carefully removed in a lab setting, so they wouldn't break on us out there. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it was significant work.
It was very difficult, and you guys did such a great job in controlling as much as possible. And what Fiona is saying is that in many cases the bones were so porous we had to take them up in blocks. So what we were able to do is remove, say, the rib cage, the chest, and the abdomen in one piece, if you will, coming up as a block with its soil intact with it. And that may prove to be, helpful not only in the recovery in the cellar, but looking at those soils now where the lungs and the abdomen were, we may be able to, in the laboratory, take a look at possible pathogens and see if these young men had, any diseases or whatever within them. So that soil block becomes important just as much as the bones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, one of the things that I thought was very interesting and became more apparent as we found those three individuals together is that, they were in a common grave, as you mentioned, that grave seemed to be not quite wide enough to hold them straight east-west. They were all kind of in the grave cockeyed a little bit to kind of basically fit them.
Yeah.
And they were all sort of overlapped. You were talking about that arm underneath another arm. And I think with all three of those individuals, there was some commingling of the skeletal remains on top or below of the other individuals.
Yeah, it was tight for them.
Yeah,
absolutely. Which also suggests a very hasty burial, which you would not expect within a family burying ground, but you might expect on a battlefield.
Nick, could you talk, or Walt, could you talk about? I know we did a little bit of research into the practices of the British Army as far as soldiers that had fallen in the course of battle and how they were handled, both their remains and their equipment. Could someone kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure, Walt. You want to handle that, or you want me to start?
Let's tag team, Nick.
Okay.
I will tell you what little bit I know, and then Nick can fill in the rest. The common practice for British soldiers was, of course, it's hard for us to realize, I think, in an age when you can run down to the store and buy a complete wardrobe overnight, just how expensive clothing was. Pieces were handmade. They took a lot of time to make. As a result, the labor cost was high. And if you're a military commander, you want nothing to go to waste. So when people fell on the battlefield, they were often buried naked. They were stripped of their clothing. The clothing was retrieved. Anything that could be reused by the military was generally stripped from the soldiers before burial. Not an uncommon practice. Now, what I don't know, and Nick, you may know, is whether there were distinctions between officers and enlisted men.
Yeah, don't know about that. That's a really good question. We do know that the British were burying their dead at Lexington and Concord. So there is a practice of that. And the British evidently, as far as I understand, did not really, because the British Empire, the sun never set, and they were all over the world, and they fought wars all over the world. And so they were never looking to repatriate their soldiers back to England that died in foreign wars. They would just simply be buried on the battlefield as such. So there is this historic precedent of battlefield burials going back to to that 18th century.
Hey, if it's okay with you guys, I want to read a question in its entirety, some of which you've touched on, but in case anybody wants to chime in, this from a listener. Does the British government memorialize any British soldier burials in Ridgefield and or vicinity? Are the British dead perhaps buried in nearby cemeteries? FYI, the British government memorializes British burials at Concord Bridge in Concord, Mass. Also, has any DNA analysis been performed on the skeletal remains? And did you protect yourselves against possible pathogens? Thanks very much.
Well, boy, there's a lot going on in that question, and it'll lead up to some of what we'll be talking about later on in the program in terms of the forensic analysis that goes on. But
Nick, I can tangentially touch on the British memorialization because early on, when we were thinking about the ultimate disposition of these remains after the forensics, I had some limited contact with the British consulate in Boston and people there, and apparently the story is that for the British today, the British Army today is interested in repatriating the remains of people who die in active conflicts today, but they will not be engaged in the repatriation of remains from anybody from a war, certainly as long ago as the American Revolution. But they would, I believe, certainly attend and honor and celebrate the lives of these people, but ceremonially, not through an intervention.
Yeah, I had some contact with the British Army Museum, and they basically expressed that same sentiment, Walt, that's a war and an age that they are not really involved with any repatriation for.
And in terms of that, the question about health hazards with these kind of burials and doing that, we did wear surgical gloves because of the fact that, we're hoping to get DNA, and we do not want to contaminate the sample with our own personal DNA. But there's really no health hazards in these kind of burials because they're in the ground. The pathogens, if they did die of diseases, are really long gone. And also, the main threat to archaeologists in terms of burials have to do with metal coffins. When individuals are in a metal coffin, pathogens get trapped within that coffin, and exposure could release airbound, some immediate pathogens if they survive, which is also, when you're dealing with remains that are almost 250 years old, just don't make it. So we are conscious of that health issue, but in these kind of burials, it really doesn't play out. We take precautions basically because we want to be able to extract DNA when possible.
Nick, I thought that the long bones in particular of most of these individuals, even some of the foot bones and the hand bones, were fairly robust and in pretty good shape. Yet the rib cage area, the abdomen, seemed to have suffered the worst and seemed to be more in worse shape than the other bones. Is that something that you expected, or were you surprised to see that?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, again, bone tells the life history of each individual. It modifies constantly. And what we saw was thick bone density and large areas of tuberosity on the bone where muscle attachments would be, which really shows that, really tells us that they were very rugged individuals. And in the first stature recording of 5'11", is a pretty good size back then. So, we see robusticity here. The interesting thing about the demographics of the four graves, or the four burials, I should say, is that they're all adult, robust males. Okay? We don't have children. We don't have females. And that certainly, I think, is one of the things that might support the hypothesis of, Ridgefield battle victims. If this was a graveyard, we would expect to see children, especially because they made up in many cases 50% of the burials in a colonial graveyard. So that demographic and the robustness of these guys and the young, these guys are 20 to 40 very consistently. And so, that all points toward supporting the hypothesis.
Hey, Nick, for the non-CSI members here around the round table, the use of the word robust suggests to me portly or heavy. Am I wrong in using that association?
Yes, you are, in the sense that when we're talking about the bone, we're not talking about soft tissue. So bone density and large tuberosities of muscle attachments are what we refer to as robust. When they're weak, when there's less bone density, then we refer to it as gracile. But primarily these were robust, not in soft tissue, but in bone, which had to adapt to the rugged life these guys had.
There's another question from a listener. Are there plans for analysis of the teeth isotopes as to where these people grew up by looking at skeletal remains?
Now, everybody's trying to get ahead of us on this. You're going to have to wait for the answer to that. I will say this as a layman's explanation about the bones. As I was recovering an upper arm, I thought it was a femur. So a big leg bone. I mean, these guys, I had said to Nick at one point, if I was going to lead a charge up the hill, if these are British individuals, those were the guys I would want to be in front, because they would look scary as heck coming up the hill at me.
Yeah. Well, and just to define a couple of the words that Nick is using, the idea of a tuberosity on a bone is buildup or just more bumpiness, if that makes sense, where a muscle would attach. So if someone had particularly large muscles, there'd be more growth on the bone to support the largeness of that muscle. So when you find bones that are really big and robust, as he said, or have a lot of tuberosity and bumpy like that, that means that they were supporting strong muscles.
The thing is, I say to Nick, those are the guys I'd want charging up the hill. He goes, or they could just be farmers that work all day and have huge muscles, which is also very true. Mm. And that's kind of where our problem is, right? We still haven't really been able to pin down who these individuals are yet. We did have some artifacts. Sarah, did you want to maybe touch on what we can say about the artifacts that we did find, the few that were there?
Yeah, sure. And one thing that, I just wanted to stress, I was thinking about this as you were all talking about the excavations. One of the reasons why it's important to have archaeologists excavate, a burial like this is because of the way that we systematically excavate, record data, map things the way that they're found, because, they were talking a lot about the positions of the bones and how, you could tell by the way that they were excavated or by the way that they were laying in the grave that they had kind of been buried quickly and buried kind of flopping over the top of one another in that kind of sense. And if they hadn't been excavated carefully, and if that information hadn't been recorded, we wouldn't have that information that helps point us to the idea of, a hasty, almost mass grave in this case, which is sort of evidence towards the battlefield context. And another aspect of that is the artifacts that were found with them, because two of the burials that they dubbed in the field burials 2 and 4, were found with some artifacts, and those were primarily buttons related to clothing. So it looks like 2 of the burials were done on people who had been stripped of their clothing, but 2 of them still had clothing remaining. And the position of the buttons, and you can see from the really great maps that Nick made in the field, correspond with the locations you'd expect them to be in for things like a jacket or a waistcoat or something like that. So, where those buttons were found in relation to the body is really important in helping us understand what these people may have been wearing, which in turn helps us figure out things about the clothing, the time period, and possibly, identification of what side they were on or who they may have been. And although we're not there yet, we do have some information from the buttons that we found. So the 2 people that were buried with clothing on both had buttons. Burial 4 had a number of buttons, about 24, most of them in the vicinity of the chest and up near the collar and on one arm, areas where you might expect buttons to be from a waistcoat or a jacket. And all of the buttons were very consistent. They were all the same. For this individual, they were the same size and the same type of construction. They basically matched. They were made of a copper alloy, these buttons. They were plain. They didn't have any stamping or engraving or any kind of design. Certainly nothing as helpful as the military insignia or anything like that. So what they did find, though, along with the buttons on this particular burial, was some evidence of fabric associated with a couple of the buttons. And Cooper's metals like copper alloys, brass, that kind of stuff, can help to preserve organic materials in the soil, especially stuff that's touching the metal. So there was a little bit of fabric or cloth or textile or something on 2 of the buttons. And our colleagues at AHS and Storage, where they have an artifact conservation lab, took a look at this stuff, and they were able to get pictures of this material under the microscope. And you could see a crisscross pattern of textile fibers when you looked at it close up. So Nick reached out to Adrian St. Pierre at the Biomuseum, who's a textile specialist, and with the photographs, that material was then identified as thread rather than fabric. So it turns out that these buttons were wrapped with thread, and not only were they wrapped with thread, they were wrapped in a particular pattern or design, which was called the basket pattern. So it was almost like a checkerboard of crisscrossing threads. And this is actually a really common style on 18th century buttons, particularly on items of clothing like waistcoats, which correspond with the positioning of the buttons. So, that really helped to kind of pinpoint the time period, these buttons. The other burial had a different set of matching buttons, and these were a material called tombac, which is an alloy of copper and brass, and that was developed in the 1760s, so in the late 1700s, it was a very common material used in buttons, again, kind of putting us in the right time period. So, we ended up with a fair amount of information from those buttons, even though they didn't point us to a particular side or regiment or anything like that. They definitely situated us in the time period of the battle. And the other artifact that was found that was initially thought to be a button, once it was cleaned up, turned out to be something else. It actually looks like it's the finial from the base of a powder horn. So this is kind of like a little plug in the base of the powder horn where the strap would be attached, so you could sling it over your shoulder. And that was found with one of the burials. So, again, kind of circumstantial evidence that's pointing us in the direction of the correct time period in a battle association. So, Nick, Scott, anybody feel free to add anything else about the artifacts if you want to jump in.
No, I think you were right to point out Nick's mapping of the buttons in the field, and it did get some confusing. I mean, at the end, we were certainly trying to expedite what we were doing in a small space and difficult conditions. And, we should have said this at the beginning. The property owners had been exceptionally kind to let us stall their renovations to their home for several months at that point. But the holidays were coming and we knew we needed to leave. So there was a little confusion on some of the buttons, but Nick's mapping will show you, there's a set of like 4 cuff buttons. It's absolutely, they're drawn where we found them. They're right along the wrist going up the forearm. And then, like you said, around the collar and around the chest. It doesn't take much to look at that map and say that this was a garment that was being worn. I think the interesting thing for me is, so now we have 2 individuals that appear to have been buried naked, 2 individuals that were buried with buttons, and what's the difference between them? Are potentially the 2 naked individuals British regulars that were stripped of all their equipment, and the other 2 individuals either Tories or Patriots that fell at the battle and were buried at the same time? Do you have you thought about that anymore, Nick, or do you have any feelings on that?
Well, I think some of those questions will be answered, hopefully, with actual laboratory forensic analysis of the remains, the carbon isotope analysis, the DNA, helping us along the way. DNA, we could maybe make an assumption they're all British, whether they're fighting for the American side or the British side. But stable carbon isotope analysis might help us get to diets during their lifetimes, especially through growth and development. So your teeth are laid down in your adolescence as you grow and develop, and the enamel stays permanent the rest of your life. It's the hardest substance of your body. And researchers can get from the teeth, the aspects of isotope that might indicate diet in various regions. So a European diet would be heavy in rye and wheat. An American diet might have more corn involved. So they could distinguish that in the early part. So if we've got individuals that, were born overseas, might they be British as opposed to Americans? But we don't know that. And then your skeletal remains itself, the bone itself, the bone, as we mentioned, modifies throughout your life. So the bone could possibly help us with identifications of the last 20 years or so of an individual's life in terms of their diet again. So a lot of these analyses are going to be extremely important to answer those kind of questions where there's a lack of any other, the artifacts, as you said, the bones were all plain. So there was no regimental insignia. There was nothing there to key us in. Does that suggest patriots coming in, as Walt mentioned, coming in from hither and yon, from the fields to defend? But how do you distinguish between loyalists and patriots? So a lot of complicated questions here, but one of the hopes in this coming year will be that the forensic analysis of the bone, the biology itself, will add to the historical and archaeological record.
Yeah, you bring up a great point that this is bigger than one archaeologist taking a look at this site and trying to draw conclusions. The interdisciplinary nature of what the team that you're putting together is. Can you talk a little bit about some of the components and some of the universities that are going to be assisting us with this in the scope of work that's still to be done?
Sure, and you're absolutely right. We work in multidisciplinary teams. There is so much information out there, and there's so much new science and technology that no individual could be, the Renaissance men that, Jefferson and Franklin were in this day and age. So we work with, a number of specialists, and combining that with Walt and historians, trying to really come to the best conclusions we can. Gary Aronson at Yale, who we mentioned before, is really spearheading the forensic analysis and putting that forensic team together. So he's doing research and cleaning the remains that we brought out in block, and looking at them in terms of gross morphology. But we've got Quinnipiac University's bioanthropology diagnostic labs are working with us. We're going to hopefully be able to have CAT scans, CT scans done on each of the bones, so that potentially, where the preservation is right, we might have a three-dimensional model of each individual. We're working with the University of Florida, where researchers down there are going to be looking at that isotope analysis I talked about, and specifically looking at the teeth. The University of Connecticut, the anthropology department, will be doing DNA in their ancient DNA labs to try to see if they can extract how much information they can extract on not just ancestry, but other aspects of these individuals' lives. So it's a combined effort. Yale, UConn, Quinnipiac. As mentioned, the Barnum Museum has been helpful. We've even been in touch with researchers at Colonial Williamsburg because of the fact that we had these cloths, and trying to understand what kind of clothing may be represented with these buttons. So it's like you said, a multidisciplinary approach, and it's going to take time. Unfortunately, because of COVID, many of these laboratories have been closed down. So as a result, we're a bit behind on that analysis, but we're really hoping with laboratories opening up that within the next year, we're going to have some pretty cool information.
As you mentioned our friends at Quinnipiac, it occurred to me a little anecdotal story about the matrix that these bones were in. So we had brought some blocks with the bones and the matrix all together down to Quinnipiac to image, as well as some of the other bones that we had recovered. And they were very confident that they were going to put it up on a couple of their imaging machines and shoot through and tell us exactly what was in that block. And they ran the machine, and then we moved into another room with a different machine. And they ran that machine, and then we went into another room with another machine. And it was the oldest machine, so it was like the super high power, everybody get away and wear lead clothing if you get near it. And they still couldn't see through the matrix. That matrix is so dense that the images that were produced with all the technology that is available to them, which is very significant, were not able to give us a really good sense of what bone condition and what bones were included in that matrix. So that's how difficult that matrix was.
Absolutely.
So, as we're kind of closing out in the last 10 minutes or so in the show, I thought it might be great to talk a little bit about what else this discovery has kind of inspired, because now, and it would be great if Walt, you could chime in on this a little bit too. This discovery has really invigorated the discussion of the Battle of Ridgefield and research into the Battle of Ridgefield within the town, and they are working with the state of Connecticut now on a number of grant proposals with the National Park Service Battlefield Protection Program to really document the battle, understand all the nuances of it, trying to figure out, exactly what happened when, at what time, in what parts of town, bound the battlefield, get a whole bunch of new information that will also be really instrumental in helping us kind of provide a context for figuring out more about these burials, but also just the kind of the significance of the research as it's going forward, and what we hope to learn in the near future.
This is one of the things that it's a spin-off of what you all found that makes this such a big event. The Ridgefield Historical Society, and I have to say the town itself collectively, found these skeletons to be a kind of energizing moment in which they said, we haven't really dug into the history of this event. We've used what other people have written for a long time, but these skeletons have raised so many questions. Maybe it's time for a complete rethink. And with the state, they worked on and secured a Phase 1 battlefield protection survey grant from the National Park Service. The Heritage Consultants, a group that has David George and Kevin McBride and David Nomek and others, have worked for the past year to recover as many primary source documents as possible. As many original accounts, reports would help them sort of define, the context of this conflict as it was acted out in Ridgefield, but also, the broader dimensions of this battle. I think because it took place along a main road, people had a tendency to think very linearly about this conflict. It's something that they thought maybe only happened along the roads or where the troops were marching. But in fact, this was a chaotic coming together of, as I had said at the beginning, people were coming from all over the country. And what they are finding out from the reports of people who lived in Ridgefield in the time, of farmers in the 1800s, is that there were artifacts that indicate, this battlefield was much wider, much broader than people thought, and there were more people involved than anyone ever recorded or knew. So there's just a wealth of new information coming to surface that it's my hope that when the actual 250th anniversary of the battle occurs in 2027, there'll be enough of this collected that we can have a real reinterpretation of the battle. And I'll hand this back, but for me, one of the most interesting questions that I would like to see answered has to do with Ridgefield itself. In 1775, a month before the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the people of Ridgefield voted together and sent to the governor of Connecticut a statement saying that we are loyal subjects of the King of England and we want nothing to do with this radicalism. I'm paraphrasing, but they made it very clear that Ridgefield was a loyalist town and liked it that way. 2 years later, they are leading the resistance to a British army marching through their town. And I find myself as a historian sitting here saying, what happened? Those people their whole town didn't change overnight, but something has gone on here. And that needs to be documented and told, and I think it's going to be part of this overall historical and archaeological revisit of the battle. At least that's what I thought.
And I think there's a lot of optimism that there are some undisturbed sites where there was conflict that occurred that potentially will yield archaeological evidence in the future, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and that will be phase 2 of this grant program. So that's what they're working towards now. So stay tuned because we're definitely going to have them on the radio show when we have more information from that work.
Hey, Nick, what's at the top of the list of things that you want to know?
Oh gosh, I think with Walt and this battlefield grant, they're going to get such a great set of what happened in terms of the history of the thing. But I'm really looking forward to the forensic work because I want to know more about these individuals, these men, and their life histories that we can glean from the bones, and rather than the others will have a broader perspective of the battle. But my interest really, and certainly I'm with Scott and Fiona and Walt, who was at the site with us also. It becomes personal. We want to know about these men in particular too, and the role they played, and who they are, and so forth. So that's what I'm really looking forward to, that aspect of the research.
Fiona, what about you?
You know, what
Yeah, I mean, well, just to, I think, tack on to Nick's thought, upon reflecting on excavating at this site, I think, it was an honor to be there and to excavate and be, with these great archaeologists, but also the lasting feeling that I'm leaving with is it's an honor to have been a part of the recovery and to be a part of this team that's going to be able to tell these people's story. And I think that's what Nick was getting at. And I hope that's a sentiment that I think all of us share today is, they have a story to be told, and it'll be really exciting to get the full story and be able to tell it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that, we were there and we disturbed them, if you will, and we have a responsibility to them to at least find out as much as we can and tell as much as their story as is going to be possible.
Yeah, and I think especially in the context of the Revolutionary War and what this means to a lot more people than just archaeologists is, paying tribute and a lot of respect towards the sacrifices that these individuals made in that greater scope.
Right, regardless of what side they were on.
Yeah,
that
definitely.
day.
Yeah.
If I can add one thing very quickly that is a great outcome already of this find. The Battle of Ridgefield, up until recently, has been a very white battle. But what David Nomek has found, and that is going to help rewrite our understanding of this, that there may have been as many as 60 enslaved African Americans involved in this conflict, whose story has not only not been told, they've been all but invisible in the past. And now we're going to tell a true, full, comprehensive American story.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah, let's just remind our listeners how they can find, follow, and be a part of all things FOSA and the Office of the State Archaeologist.
Sure. If you want to follow the Office of State Archaeology, you can follow our Facebook page. And we also have a website through UConn at osa.uconn.edu.
Yeah, in FOSA, you can find us at fosa-ct.org. That's FOSA, Connecticut, ORG. Walt, where can we follow you?
I am on the verge of retirement, but you can find my website at cthistory.org, and I invite you to learn a bit more about Connecticut history at todayincthistory.com.
I guess that's it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for participating. It was a great conversation about a great site that's going to, I think, yield a lot of interesting stories.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.